I want to start this post by saying I always thought my wife and I had the kind of marriage people dream about. For 14 years, it seemed like we had built a life that was unshakable. The kind of partnership where people would say, "Wow, you two really have it figured out." We're both 40, met in our mid-20s, and from the very start, it just clicked. She's kind, cheerful, reliable, the type of person who walks into a room and everyone feels instantly at ease. If you ask me, she's the glue that held our family together. We've never had a serious argument. Sure, we disagreed sometimes, what couple doesn't, but it was always resolved with a smile, a hug, and the reassurance that we were a team. We didn't just love each other, we genuinely liked each other, you know? There was trust, warmth, and a spark that never seemed to fade. Every aspect of our life together felt perfect. We had our routines, weekend coffee dates, movie nights, spontaneous road trips, and she always made everything feel effortless. Even when life threw curveballs, we faced them together. She was my partner in every sense of the word. I felt like the luckiest guy in the world. For years, I told anyone who would listen that I couldn't have asked for a better wife. I thought we were building a future that would last a lifetime. But looking back now, I can see the cracks. They were small at first, barely noticeable. It's easy to overlook little things when you're living inside the warmth of what you believe to be a perfect marriage. And maybe that's why, when everything began to change, it felt like the ground beneath me was crumbling, and I didn't even realize it. For the first 13 years of our marriage, everything felt steady and unshakable. We had built a life filled with trust and shared dreams. She had a laugh that could brighten the darkest days, and there wasn't a thing about her I wouldn't have defended. But last year, things started to change, not all at once, just in small, almost imperceptible ways. At first, it was so subtle I thought I was imagining it. It began with her schedule. My wife works in theater alongside my best friend, a job that she has always been passionate about. She would come home every night, eager to talk about the day's rehearsals or share funny stories about their boss. Our evenings were filled with these stories, her voice full of animation as she described the chaotic and colorful world of the stage. Then, one night, she came home later than usual. I remember asking, "Rough day at work?" and she smiled faintly before saying, "The boss is getting stricter. There's just so much to do before the next performance." At the time, I believed her without hesitation. I mean, why wouldn't I? This was my wife. If she said her boss was making her work longer hours, that was the end of it. Soon, those late nights started happening more often. Twice a week became 3, then 4. When I asked if everything was okay, she reassured me it was just the demands of the upcoming performance. "It's just temporary," she said. "Once this is over, things will go back to normal." I wanted to believe her, so I didn't push. Instead, I turned to my best friend, who worked at the same theater. I casually brought up the topic, asking if the workload had really gotten that bad. He confirmed everything she said. "Yeah, the boss has been cracking the whip," he told me. "Rehearsals are going long, and there's a lot of pressure to deliver." His words eased my mind. I didn't like the idea of her working herself to exhaustion, but at least I knew it wasn't personal. Or so I thought. Still, something felt off. She wasn't just working late, her demeanor was shifting too. She stopped coming home with those funny stories she used to share. Conversations grew shorter, more guarded. She seemed distracted, and when I asked what was on her mind, she'd just smile and say, "Nothing, just tired." The woman who used to light up our home with her warmth now seemed like a distant shadow of herself. And I told myself it was stress, plain and simple. The performance was less than a month away, and I reasoned that once the curtain fell, things would go back to the way they were. But deep down, I felt a gnawing sense of unease. Then came the nights when she started coming home even later, well past midnight. These weren't the usual long rehearsal days she'd mentioned before. Sometimes, she wouldn't even text to let me know she'd be late, which was completely out of character. When she did come home, she'd look exhausted, almost drained of life. She'd drop her bag at the door, mumble something about work, and head straight to bed. I tried to be understanding. I told myself, she's under a lot of pressure. Just be patient. But it wasn't just the late nights. It was the lack of connection. Our once vibrant conversations turned into brief exchanges about grocery lists or what to watch on TV. She didn't laugh the way she used to, and her smile didn't reach her eyes. I wanted to help, to be there for her, but every time I asked what was wrong, she brushed me off. "I'm fine," she'd insist. "Really, it's just work." It wasn't fine. It couldn't be fine. The spark that had always defined our relationship was slipping away, and I didn't know how to get it back. A month before New Year's, I decided I needed to do something. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference. Maybe she was too proud or too stressed to admit that she needed help, but I wasn't going to stand by and watch her burn out. So, I started making small gestures, cooking her favorite meals, surprising her with flowers, leaving notes in her bag that said, "I'm proud of you. We'll get through this." I wanted her to know I was in her corner, no matter what. But nothing seemed to break through the wall that had formed between us. As much as I tried to rationalize it, work stress, holiday pressure, there was a growing part of me that couldn't ignore the doubts creeping into my mind. What if there was something else? What if it wasn't just the demands of her job keeping her out so late? As the days rolled on, I kept telling myself to be patient. Maybe this was just a rough patch, a test for us to navigate together. Every marriage has them, right? 14 years of love didn't just vanish overnight. Still, the little things started to eat at me. It wasn't just her late nights. It was the way she'd been withdrawing from our life together. My wife, the woman who used to pour her heart into every corner of our home, now seemed like she was just existing in it. She'd spend less time with me in the evenings, retreating to the bedroom with her phone or claiming she needed to rest her mind. Our weekend coffee dates, once a sacred ritual for us, had become occasional at best. And when she did join me, she seemed distracted, her eyes flicking toward her phone like she was waiting for a message that was more important than our conversation. At first, I ignored it. Everyone has busy periods, and I wanted to respect her space. I didn't want to be that guy, the controlling, paranoid husband who turned every minor thing into a fight. But there was one moment I'll never forget. It was a quiet evening, and I suggested we watch a movie. She nodded, half-heartedly, as she sat on the couch scrolling through her phone. I reached over to hold her hand, a simple gesture, something we'd done 1,000 times before. She pulled away. "Oh, sorry," she said quickly, almost as if she hadn't realized she'd done it. She offered a brief smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. I was just in the middle of reading something. I nodded, trying to act like it didn't bother me. But that one small action spoke volumes. It wasn't like her. She used to be so affectionate, always leaning into me during movies or brushing my hair back when I was deep in thought. Now, it felt like she was keeping me at arm's length, not just physically, but emotionally too. My best friend, let's call him Matt, noticed it too. He and my wife worked together in the theater, and he'd always been someone I trusted completely. We'd been close since college, and over the years, he'd become like a brother to me. One night, over a beer, I brought it up. "She's been distant lately," I said, staring into my glass. "I don't know if it's work stress or if there's something I'm missing." Matt looked thoughtful, then nodded. "Theater's been crazy lately," he said. "The boss has been on everyone's case, cracking down on deadlines. She's probably just tired, man. Don't overthink it." I wanted to believe him. After all, he worked with her every day. If something was wrong, surely he'd know, right? But then, there was this moment. He paused for just a second, so brief I almost didn't notice, and avoided meeting my eyes. It was subtle, but it stuck with me. Still, I brushed it off. Why would Matt lie to me? He'd never given me a reason to doubt him before. As the holidays approached, I tried to push my unease aside. If work was stressing her out, maybe I could take some of the pressure off. I started handling more chores around the house, planning little surprises to cheer her up, even offering to host Christmas dinner so she wouldn't have to worry about it. She smiled and said she appreciated it, but something about her gratitude felt hollow. Like she was going through the motions. A week before Christmas, she dropped a bombshell. "I think I might have to work through the holidays," she said, avoiding my gaze as she folded laundry. "The performance is coming up, and the boss wants us to finalize everything before New Year's." It felt like a punch to the gut. Christmas had always been our favorite time of year, a chance to slow down, reconnect, and make memories. And now, she was telling me she'd be spending it at work? "Can't you ask for just 1 or 2 days off?" I asked, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. "Even Christmas Eve?" She hesitated. "I'll see what I can do," she said softly. But her tone made it clear she wasn't holding out much hope. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Okay. I get it. Just, let me know." But I didn't get it. Not really. The night before the performance, I decided to surprise her. I wanted to show her I was still her biggest supporter, no matter how distant things had felt lately. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference. I figured I'd pick her up from the theater, maybe grab some hot chocolate on the way home, and spend the evening talking about whatever was on her mind. I arrived at the theater early, hoping to catch her before she left. As I walked inside, I felt a flicker of excitement, like this was my chance to bridge the gap that had been growing between us. The dressing room door was slightly ajar, and I could hear muffled voices inside. I froze, not wanting to interrupt. And that's when everything changed. That week, the distance between us became a chasm. She was barely home, constantly absorbed in rehearsals for the upcoming performance. She left early in the morning and didn't return until late at night, if she came home at all. I understood the demands of theater, or at least I thought I did. This was crunch time, after all. But it wasn't just her absence that hurt, it was the feeling that I was losing her in the process. Our mornings, which were once filled with shared cups of coffee and gentle kisses, became hurried exchanges. She'd rush out the door with a quick, "See you later," barely glancing at me as she grabbed her things. In the evenings, I'd sit alone at the dining table, staring at the empty seat across from me, waiting for the sound of her key in the lock. Most nights, it never came. It wasn't just her physical absence that weighed on me, it was the emotional void she left behind. By midweek, I was struggling to keep it together. I kept reminding myself that this was temporary, that things would settle down after the performance. But even that reassurance was starting to wear thin. On Thursday, I decided to text her during a break at work. "Hey, hope rehearsals are going okay. Just wanted to say I miss you. Let me know if you need anything." Her reply came hours later. "Thanks, sweetie. Things are crazy here, but I'll try to come home earlier tonight." She didn't. Instead, I fell asleep on the couch waiting for her, the TV playing some movie I wasn't really watching. When I woke up in the middle of the night, the house was silent. She hadn't come home at all. I told myself not to read too much into it. Rehearsals could run late. Maybe she stayed at the theater to save time. But a small voice in the back of my mind kept asking, "Why didn't she tell you?" The day of the performance finally arrived, and with it, a strange sense of relief. This was it, the finish line. After this, we could go back to normal. I couldn't attend the show because of work commitments, but I texted her before it started to wish her good luck. "Big night. You're going to be amazing. Can't wait to hear all about it later. Thanks, love. Fingers crossed everything goes smoothly. See you after. For the first time all week, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe tonight would be different. When I got home, I made sure everything was perfect. I set out her favorite tea, lit a candle on the coffee table, and even put on her favorite music playlist to set the mood. But hours passed, and she still wasn't home. It was almost midnight when I heard the door open. She walked in with a radiant smile, holding a bouquet of flowers in her hands. "You're still up?" she asked, her tone light but surprised. "Of course," I said, standing to greet her. "How'd it go?" She placed the flowers on the table and sank into the couch, letting out a satisfied sigh. "It was amazing. The audience loved it. We got a standing ovation." I couldn't help but smile, seeing her so happy. "I'm proud of you," I said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "The flowers are beautiful." Her smile faltered just slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Oh, these? They're from some fans. You know how theater people are. They love giving flowers." Something about the way she said it felt off. But I shook the thought away. Why wouldn't her fans give her flowers? She was talented, and tonight had been a big night. "Want some tea?" I asked, motioning to the set I'd prepared. She shook her head. "Thanks, but I'm exhausted. I just want to crash." She didn't even take the flowers upstairs. She left them on the table as she headed to bed, leaving me standing there, feeling like an outsider in my own marriage. Over the next few days, that bouquet became a symbol of everything I couldn't put into words. It sat there on the table, vibrant and fragrant, a constant reminder of how disconnected we'd become. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference. Something about those flowers gnawed at me, a tiny seed of doubt I couldn't quite shake. They weren't the kind of arrangement fans usually give after a performance, they were too intimate, too personal. But I told myself I was being ridiculous. She was my wife. She wouldn't lie to me. Would she? The days after the performance didn't feel like the fresh start I'd been hoping for. If anything, things got worse. She was still distant, her once cheerful demeanor replaced with something harder to define. She wasn't cold, exactly, more like distracted. Like her mind was somewhere else entirely. I kept waiting for her to talk about the show, to tell me about the performance, the cast, the behind-the-scenes chaos she used to love sharing with me. But every time I brought it up, she brushed me off with vague answers. "It was great," she said one evening when I tried to dig deeper. "Come on," I pressed, trying to coax her into a conversation. "You used to love telling me all the little details. What about the set? The costumes? Any funny stories from backstage?" She gave me a tired smile. "Nothing much to tell. It was a good night, but now we're all just relieved it's over." Her words didn't sit right. This was the same woman who used to call me on her way home from rehearsals just to share some small anecdote about the props manager or a hilarious line mishap. Now, after her biggest show of the year, she couldn't come up with anything. But I let it go. Again. As the week wore on, I couldn't stop thinking about those flowers. They were still on the coffee table, slowly wilting. She hadn't even bothered to put them in water. That alone was strange. My wife loved flowers, she'd always take care of them, fussing over the arrangement and making sure they stayed fresh as long as possible. One night, while she was in the shower, I picked up the card that came with the bouquet. It was plain, white, with just 2 words written on it. "For you." There was no name, no signature. Nothing. It didn't feel like something a fan would write. Fans usually signed their cards, right? A little, "from your biggest admirer," or a name to show their appreciation. This wasn't like that. This was personal. I told myself to stop spiraling. I was being paranoid, reading too much into something innocent. But the seed of doubt had taken root, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, it kept growing. The real breaking point came a few days later. It was a Friday evening, and I was sitting at home alone, again. She'd told me she had a wrap-up meeting at the theater, something about discussing what worked and what could be improved for the next show. She didn't say when she'd be home, but I figured it wouldn't be late. After all, the performance was over, there wasn't any reason for her to stay there all night anymore. But as the hours ticked by, my frustration grew. By 11 p.m., I'd texted her twice with no response. Me, hey, everything okay? Just wondering when you'll be home. Me, still at the theater? No reply. By midnight, I'd gone from annoyed to genuinely worried. I thought about calling her, but something held me back. It felt like I was walking a tightrope, teetering between concern and suspicion. Finally, at 12:30 a.m., she texted back. Sorry, lost track of time. Heading home soon. It was short, curt, and gave me no reassurance. She walked through the door an hour later, looking exhausted but oddly content. You're still up? She asked, glancing at me briefly before kicking off her shoes. Yeah, I said, trying to keep my voice even. What took so long? She shrugged. We just had a lot to talk about. You know how it is. No, I didn't know how it was. But I didn't say that. Instead, I nodded and let the conversation die, even though my stomach churned with unease. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a thought hit me. I couldn't keep sitting at home, waiting and wondering. I needed answers. The next time she said she was staying late at the theater, I decided I'd go see for myself. The idea of visiting the theater stayed with me all weekend. At first, I felt guilty for even considering it. I mean, what kind of husband just shows up unannounced to check on his wife? It felt invasive. But the more I thought about it, the more the doubts gnawed at me. For 14 years, I had trusted her completely. But now? Something was wrong. The late nights, the flowers, the distance, it all added up to something I couldn't ignore. If I was wrong, fine. I'd apologize and deal with the embarrassment. But if I was right? I couldn't even finish that thought. On Monday, she told me she had another wrap-up meeting at the theater. It was almost like she handed me the perfect opportunity. You'll be home late again? I asked, keeping my tone casual. She hesitated, which struck me as odd. Probably, she said after a moment. There's still a lot to go over. You know how the boss is. I nodded, even though my stomach churned. I didn't know how the boss was. I'd never met the guy, but from the way she and Matt had described him, he sounded like a perfectionist who ran a tight ship. That explanation had worked before, but now it felt like an excuse. That evening, I pretended everything was normal. I kissed her goodbye, told her to drive safe, and settled into my usual spot on the couch. Except this time, I wasn't staying there. At 8:30 p.m., I grabbed my keys and headed for the theater. It wasn't far, just a 15-minute drive. The whole way there, I felt like my chest was going to explode. I told myself to calm down, to keep an open mind. Maybe I'd walk in and find her and Matt sitting with the boss, going over paperwork. Maybe she'd laugh and say, "What are you doing here?" Maybe this whole thing would end with me feeling foolish but relieved. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was driving towards something that would change everything. The theater parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived, just a few scattered cars under the dim streetlights. I parked at the far end, away from the entrance, and sat there for a moment, trying to collect myself. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. What was I even going to say? Hey, just thought I'd stop by to see how your meeting's going. It sounded ridiculous. Finally, I took a deep breath, grabbed my phone, and stepped out of the car. The front doors of the theater were unlocked, which wasn't surprising. The building was always busy with rehearsals and set construction, even late at night. Inside, the place was eerily quiet. The stage lights were off, casting long shadows across the empty seats. I made my way through the aisles, my footsteps echoing in the vast space. I didn't see anyone at first, which only made me feel more uneasy. If there was a meeting, shouldn't I hear voices? Laughter? Something? As I got closer to the backstage area, I noticed a faint glow coming from one of the dressing rooms. My heart raced. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear muffled voices. I hesitated, my hand hovering just inches from the doorknob. Every instinct told me to turn around and leave, to let it go. But something stronger, curiosity, doubt, fear, pushed me forward. Slowly, I pushed the door open. And that's when I saw them. The door creaked softly as I pushed it open, just enough to see inside without making my presence known. What I saw felt like a punch to the gut. There they were, my wife, my best friend Matt, and her boss. The three people I trusted most in the world, laughing, whispering, and completely naked. Matt was leaning back on the dressing room couch, a smug grin on his face, while her boss, this supposed tyrant, stood close to my wife, his hands wandering in ways I couldn't bear to describe. And there she was, my wife of 14 years, the woman I had built my life around, smiling at them both in a way that made my blood run cold. It was as if I had walked into someone else's nightmare. I froze, barely breathing, my mind racing to comprehend what I was seeing. How could she do this? How could they do this? My best friend, the guy who'd stood by me through college and every major milestone since, how could he betray me like this? And her boss, the man she'd claimed was driving her to exhaustion? Was this what those late rehearsals really looked like? Every doubt I'd ignored, every excuse I'd accepted, came crashing down on me all at once. I wanted to burst into the room, to demand answers, to unleash every ounce of rage boiling inside me. But something stopped me. Maybe it was shock, or maybe it was the sheer enormity of their betrayal. Either way, I found myself stepping back instead of forward. And then, a different thought took hold: let them have their moment. They won't see what's coming next. I pulled out my phone, my hands trembling as I hit record. For 5 excruciating seconds, I captured the scene in front of me, the laughter, the intimacy, the betrayal laid bare. I didn't need to stay any longer. That was all I needed. Quietly, I stepped back into the shadows, slipping out the way I had come. They never saw me. The drive home felt surreal. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, replaying the scene in my head over and over. It didn't feel real, and yet the video on my phone was proof that it was. Anger bubbled under the surface, but it was tempered by something colder: resolve. I wasn't going to confront them, not yet. They didn't deserve the satisfaction of seeing me broken. No, if they wanted to play games, I'd show them how it was done. I spent the rest of the night sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the screen of my phone. The video was only 5 seconds long, but it might as well have been 5 hours. Every frame was a reminder of how completely they had shattered my trust. By the time the sun came up, I had a plan. The next few days were a blur of quiet preparation. On the surface, I pretended everything was fine. I smiled when she came home late, nodded along when she talked about work, and even managed to crack a joke or two. Inside, though, I was calculating every move. Step 1 was simple: gather more evidence. I needed to be sure this wasn't a one-time thing. So, I kept an eye on her patterns, noting every late night and every vague excuse. Step 2 was where things got tricky. I couldn't just focus on her, I had to consider Matt and her boss, too. This wasn't just about her betrayal, it was about the way all three of them had made me feel like a fool. And step 3? That was the part one looked forward to the most, delivering the consequences. By the time New Year's Eve rolled around, everything was in place. She was buzzing with excitement, talking about how they'd been invited to a small celebration after the final performance of the season. "I'll probably be home late," she said casually, sipping her coffee. "Don't wait up, okay? Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference." I smiled and nodded, just like I always did. But inside, I was counting down the hours until I could set my plan into motion. New Year's Eve came with an eerie calm. The kind of calm where you know a storm is brewing, but no one else can see it. I woke up that morning with a strange sense of clarity, like everything in my life had been leading to this moment. She was unusually cheerful, humming to herself as she got ready for the day. If I didn't know better, I might have thought nothing was wrong. She even asked if I had any plans for the evening. "No, just a quiet night at home," I replied, keeping my tone light. "You'll be at the theater party?" She nodded, smiling. "Yeah, just a quick get-together after the performance. I'll try not to be too late, though." The ease with which she lied was almost impressive. When she left that afternoon, I began the final phase of my plan. The first thing I did was pack. It didn't take long, just a few suitcases with my clothes, my personal documents, and a few sentimental items I couldn't bear to leave behind. I didn't plan to come back, and I wanted her to feel that finality when she realized I was gone. Then, I set up the distribution for the video. It wasn't just about her, it was about all three of them. Her, my best friend Matt, and her boss. They had turned my life into a joke, so I decided to make sure the world saw the punchline. I emailed the clip to every major news outlet in the city, along with an anonymous tip: "Scandal in the local theater community. Boss caught in compromising position with 2 employees." I attached a note detailing who they were and where the footage came from. But I didn't stop there. I also sent the video to our close circle of friends and family, making sure to highlight Matt's betrayal. I wanted him to know that I wasn't just walking away quietly. Finally, I added one more layer to the plan. I had spent the past week chatting with Matt's 20-year-old daughter. She didn't know the details, of course, but I made sure to come across as friendly, supportive, and interested in her life. The morning of New Year's Eve, I sent her a carefully worded message. "Hey, I know this might seem sudden, but I'd love to meet up and talk about something important. I think we could really connect on a deeper level." To my surprise, and maybe a little to my horror, she said yes. By the time evening rolled around, I was ready. I made one final check of the house, making sure all my belongings were either packed or out of sight. Then, just as she was preparing to leave for the theater party, I handed her a shopping list. "Do me a favor?" I said casually. "Pick these up on your way home. We're out of a few essentials." She barely glanced at it before nodding. "Sure, no problem." I watched her walk out the door, her cheerful hum echoing in my ears. The moment the door clicked shut, I grabbed my bags, loaded them into the car, and drove away. I didn't look back. That night, while the city celebrated the start of a new year, my emails began to spread. The local news outlets were the first to pick it up, posting cryptic headlines about a scandal in the theater world. Social media buzzed with speculation as the video made its rounds. I could only imagine the chaos that would unfold once she saw it, or once Matt and her boss realized the walls were closing in. As for me, I drove to my brother's house and let myself in with the spare key he'd given me months ago. I didn't tell him what had happened yet, but I knew he'd support me when the time came. Sitting on his couch with a glass of whiskey in my hand, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: relief. They thought they had gotten away with it. They thought I was clueless. But now, the truth was out. The first part of my plan was already in motion. The video of my wife, Matt, and her boss was making its way across news outlets and social media. Every click, every share, every comment was another nail in the coffin of their betrayal. But there was one more act of revenge I had carefully prepared, something personal, just for Matt. You see, over the last week, I'd been building a connection with his 20-year-old daughter. I knew her through him, of course, but we'd never been particularly close. That changed when I started reaching out to her. At first, it was small talk, checking in on how she was doing, asking about her life. She seemed to appreciate the attention, even opened up about how difficult her relationship with her dad had been lately. By the time New Year's rolled around, I had gained her trust. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference. Enough that when I suggested we spend some time together, she didn't hesitate to say yes. We met earlier that day. I had made it clear that I wanted to get to know her better, and she seemed genuinely excited. To her, I was just her dad's old friend, a nice guy who cared about her well-being. But for me, it was part of something bigger. After a few hours of talking, laughing, and a little flirting, things escalated. She leaned in, and before I knew it, we were sharing a moment of intimacy that I'm sure would have made her father's blood boil. It wasn't something I had planned for originally, but when the opportunity presented itself, I didn't stop it. I made sure to capture the moment on video, not to exploit her, but to ensure Matt felt the full weight of his betrayal when he realized how deeply it had backfired. That night, as the clock inched closer to midnight, I sent Matt the video. The message was simple. Happy New Year, Matt. Thought you'd want to see who I've been spending my time with. Attached was the clip of his daughter and me, sharing a moment he could never take back. I imagined him opening it, first with confusion, then with mounting rage as the reality sank in. The same rage I had felt when I discovered what he'd been doing with my wife. While I waited for the fallout, I poured myself another drink and watched as the chaos unfolded online. News outlets were picking up the theater scandal faster than I'd anticipated. Comments flooded the posts, some condemning, others speculating. People were already connecting the dots: the theater boss, 2 employees, and a very public betrayal. I thought about my wife seeing the news. Would she recognize how thoroughly she'd been exposed? Would she realize it was me who had pulled the strings? Or would she blame someone else, the way she had always deflected blame in the past? And Matt, how long would it take for him to connect the dots between the theater scandal and the personal video I had sent him? Either way, the damage was done. I stayed up late that night, my phone buzzing constantly with notifications from friends, family, and acquaintances reacting to the news. My wife hadn't called or texted yet, which told me she was probably still at the party, or maybe dealing with the fallout in real time. Matt, on the other hand, didn't stay silent for long. At 2 a.m., my phone lit up with a series of angry, profanity-laden texts from him. Matt, what the hell is wrong with you? Matt, you're a sick expletive. Stay away from my family. Matt, I trusted you. I stared at the messages, a cold satisfaction washing over me. Me, you trusted me? That's funny. I trusted you too, Matt. Look where that got me. After that, I muted his number. I didn't need to hear his excuses or his outrage. As far as I was concerned, he'd earned every ounce of pain he was feeling. By the next morning, the scandal had reached its peak. My wife's theater was being dragged through the mud online, with people calling for boycotts and questioning the leadership. Her boss, her lover, was being publicly shamed, his reputation in shambles. I didn't know where she was at that moment, but I imagined her waking up to a flurry of missed calls and texts, realizing the life she had built on lies was crumbling around her. And me? I was already gone. I had moved my things to my brother's house and started laying the groundwork for my divorce. I didn't want to hear her excuses or apologies. I wanted a clean break, and the satisfaction of knowing she, Matt, and her boss would never forget what they'd done. By New Year's morning, everything was out in the open. The theater scandal was plastered across social media, local news outlets, and even a few national gossip blogs. The video I had sent to the news outlets had done its job spectacularly, dragging my wife, Matt, and her boss into the harsh spotlight of public scrutiny. Meanwhile, my phone was flooded with calls and texts, most of them from people who couldn't believe what they'd seen. My family reached out, confused and concerned, but I wasn't ready to explain everything to them yet. The one person I hadn't heard from was her. My wife. It wasn't until late in the evening that her name finally popped up on my phone. She called me 3 times in a row before switching to text. Her, where are you? We need to talk. Her, I don't know what's happening, but please come home. Her, this is all a misunderstanding. I can explain. I stared at the messages, my jaw tightening. A misunderstanding? After everything I'd seen with my own eyes? The audacity of her words almost made me laugh. I didn't respond. A few hours later, she showed up at my brother's house. I'd given her no indication of where I was staying, but she must have guessed. It was the only place I could go on such short notice. The doorbell rang, and when my brother answered, there she was, looking distraught and frantic. "Is he here?" she asked, her voice cracking. I stepped into the doorway, crossing my arms. "What do you want?" I said coldly. Her face crumpled at the sight of me. "Please, just talk to me. We can work this out. I can explain everything." "Explain what?" I snapped, my voice rising. "Explain how you've been lying to me for months. How you've been sneaking around with my best friend and your boss. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference. How you turned 14 years of marriage into a joke." She flinched at my words, tears welling up in her eyes. "It's not what you think." "Don't," I cut her off, my tone sharp. "Don't insult my intelligence. I saw you. I have proof. There's nothing left to explain." Her tears fell freely now, but I didn't feel an ounce of sympathy. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice trembling. "I was confused, and things got out of hand. But I love you." "You don't love me," I interrupted. "If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. If you loved me, you would have respected our marriage." For a moment, she just stood there, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed. But I wasn't moved. The time for tears and apologies had passed. The next morning, I received an email from Matt. "Matt, I know I messed up. I can't undo what I did, but please don't drag my daughter into this. She has nothing to do with our mistakes." I sat back, rereading his words with a grim smile. His plea was rich, coming from the same man who had betrayed me so completely. I typed out a reply. Your daughter is a grown woman, Matt. She makes her own choices. Just like you did. Maybe now you'll understand what betrayal feels like." After hitting send, I blocked his email. As for her boss, the fallout was just as satisfying. The theater announced his resignation within 48 hours of the video going viral, citing personal misconduct as the reason. My wife's career wasn't spared either. The theater, eager to distance itself from the scandal, quietly let her go. She'd spent years building her reputation in that world, and now it was in tatters. Good. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. I wasn't naive enough to think this would erase the pain or make everything okay. But knowing that they were finally facing the consequences of their actions gave me a sense of closure I desperately needed. And yet, even with all the chaos I'd unleashed, there was one more piece of the puzzle left to deal with. Her. The day after her tearful visit to my brother's house, I made it clear there was nothing left to discuss. I texted her 2 words, "We're done." Then I forwarded my lawyer's contact information and let her know she'd be hearing from them soon. Her response came almost immediately. "Please don't do this. We can fix this." "I made a mistake, but we can still be a family." "I'll do anything. Just talk to me." The desperation in her words might have tugged at my heart once, but not anymore. I had given her everything, my trust, my love, my loyalty, and she had repaid me by throwing it all away. I didn't reply. That afternoon, I made a final trip to the house we had once shared. It wasn't to reconcile or talk. I had no interest in hearing more lies or excuses. I was there to pick up the last of my belongings and to make it clear this chapter of my life was closed. She was there when I arrived, waiting in the living room. The moment she saw me, she rushed over, her eyes red from crying. "I know you're angry," she began, her voice shaky. "But if you just give me a chance to explain." "There's nothing to explain," I interrupted, keeping my tone even. "You made your choices. Now you have to live with them." Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might drop to her knees. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I can change. I'll do anything." I shook my head. "It's too late for that. You didn't just hurt me, you destroyed everything we built together. There's no coming back from that." Her sobs filled the silence as I walked past her, heading upstairs to collect the last of my things. As I packed, I noticed the little reminders of our life together, the photos on the wall, the trinkets we'd collected on vacations, the notes we used to leave each other. They should have made me sad, but all I felt was anger. She had taken something beautiful and turned it into a lie. When I was done, I made my way back downstairs. She was sitting on the couch now, clutching one of our wedding photos like it was the last lifeline in a sinking ship. "Are you really going to leave me like this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I stopped in the doorway, my hand on the frame. "You left me first," I said simply. "You just didn't have the decency to tell me." And with that, I walked out of the house for the last time. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork and lawyer meetings. The divorce process moved faster than I expected, thanks to the airtight evidence I had gathered. She didn't contest anything, not the house, not the finances, not even the separation of property. I think she knew she didn't have a leg to stand on. By the end of January, it was official. 14 years of marriage, reduced to a few signatures on a page. As for Matt, I didn't hear from him again after our last exchange. His daughter, however, stayed in touch. We moved in together shortly after the divorce was finalized, and for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of happiness. She was kind, understanding, and surprisingly mature for her age. While our relationship started as part of my revenge, it quickly grew into something genuine. When I told her about the video I had sent to her father, she was surprisingly unfazed. "He's a terrible person," she said simply. "He had it coming." 3 years later, we're still together. We recently welcomed a baby girl into the world, a fresh start in every sense of the word. Do I regret what I did? Sometimes. Revenge doesn't heal wounds, it just redirects the pain. But if I'm being honest, I don't lose sleep over it. My wife, Matt, and her boss made their choices. They underestimated me. They thought I'd roll over, that I'd let their betrayal go unanswered. They were wrong. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference.